Welcome to Your Anxious Child, 5-Minute Solutions, a podcast dedicated to providing practical advice and support for parents of anxious children. This advice is informational in nature and not a substitute for a consultation with a licensed mental health professional. And now, here's your host, Dr. Edward Plimpton.
Welcome back to Your Anxious Child, 5-Minute Solutions and Interviews with Experts. Today, we have the privilege of talking with William Dobud, who, with Nevin Harper, has just written the book Kids These Days, Understanding and Supporting Youth Mental Health. This is an ambitious but kind of very important book that is asking us to kind of step back and take a larger view of what is causing mental health problems in our youth, anxiety, obviously, for this podcast in particular. So, Will, thank you for talking with us today. And just tell this is actually your third book you've written, I believe.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you came to write this book with Nevin Harper.
Yeah. So from about 18 years old, I'm from from Maryland. That's where I grew up. Spent some time in Massachusetts near where you are. When I went to boarding school, and I grew up as an outdoorsy kid, and so when I started going to college, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I got a job working in the outdoors with youth, and I just never looked back. I thought I could just do this forever. I loved working. I'm one of those people that can jokingly kind of say, I really have not like really worked a day in my life because it's so fun to be out on adventures and things like that. Um, but when I started with studying psychology. I switched over to social work. Um, and when it came time to read theory and understand the latest neuroscience or therapy speak, I knew that I was good at being around young people and probably I was pretty engaging, but I couldn't explain it. So research was always really interesting to me, trying to figure out what the heck is going on with this. And I have I've been a musician my whole life, and I have this idea that if anyone's better at me at anything, I want to meet them and learn everything I can from them. And so that started, I saw anyone that wrote about therapy in the outdoors, I would try to find them, try to talk with them. And so that led to meeting a lot of people, and I grew confident in myself as a therapist. I started traveling and working at any organization that would take me, even if I could like volunteer for a few weeks. So
Uh-huh.
that brought me all over the US. I met my partner Renee. We met in Alaska, and so she's from Australia, so I came to Australia, and I thought, oh, there might be a gap in services here. Let's start a nonprofit and do some outdoor therapy work. And that was really great for a long time, and then we had COVID, but that whole time I was doing research on my own, and so what happened is I just got connected with Nevin, and weirdly enough, I got to go to Norway to do some research on a outdoor therapy program there. I got to do an expedition with a group of young people, and our mutual friend in Norway, because Nevin was doing consulting work in Norway, they put us together, and we've just had a really awesome writing relationship, which is really nice to have someone to bounce things off of. I think we can get to this in the book, but I think one of the best parts of Kids These Days was that it was written by two people. We were wrestling with ideas and, not disagreeing in a nasty way, but having those sort of talks. So my life has been, for the last about 20 years working with young people. I am a social worker. I've trained both in the US and Australia. And my research is I try to write about, um, in a sense, I guess this is my goal, is what is really most important to the public interest? Like, if I'm gonna write a peer-reviewed article, not that anyone reads these things, but, like, what what would actually help the average clinician? What information is really there? So and Nevin and I are both pretty, like, you know, theoretically anarchist about things, as you could probably tell throughout the book. So we often try to write in a sense of what really hasn't been talked about that needs to be talked about. Because as you will know this in the therapy world, a lot of books are written from this, I better sell my modality the best way possible. And so that's great for selling books and getting people to come to your training. But does that really move the needle on therapy outcomes? Who knows? The data isn't that convincing about that. Um, but this particular book, Nevin and I jumped into it by really thinking about youth and that what do we see when we really zoom out here? Like, you know, at the end of the day, we all know that people receive more mental health treatment than ever before, and still somehow the numbers seem to be going in the inverse direction. So that was sort of our motivation, and to cover a range of topics, and um, yeah, so that's where it came out of.
So, in the book, you're trying to help us kind of step back. And in one way, in many kind of different ways, but one of them is just in terms of how as a beginning, how we begin to think about children and kind of what they're going through. And you have made comparisons at different times between, or suggested links between Socrates and pinball machines.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could just explain how you could even bring those two into the same conversation.
Sure. So, great question. Um, one of the things the title of the book is a funny one because we actually fought with publishers about it. But Nevin, when he started talking to these experts that we interviewed throughout the book, he created a shared Dropbox folder called Kids These Days. That was it. And so I didn't really know how to start the first chapter. Um, in a compelling way, and I just started my own deep dive into how long have adults been complaining about youth. And so we traced it back to start the book with this, this caricature of Socrates, who was said to walk around bemoaning kids. They were lazy, disrespectful. They didn't read. They didn't understand the Socratic method. All of these. And so that was really fascinating to me. That you could go back to 400 BC. This is when we counted years in the wrong direction. And so this was um, really quite interesting to me. And then you can get to like when we were emailing back and forth, like Outward Bound, and the founding of Outward Bound was these declines of modern youth. And what's interesting is a lot of times when people complain about uh, the state of society, or they complain about kids, they always have to use the word modern as if this is the only time that will ever exist. Like Kurt Hahn complained about advanced locomotion, like the fastest car went like 40 miles an hour. And so
That's the
what
founder of Outward Bound, by the way.
as the co-founder of Our Bound, yes. And he said a bunch of other things, like in the 30s, like it's all because of tranquilizers and stimulants. Like today, that's evidence-based practice, Like, so there was this story of I mean, someone we didn't really make fun of that much, but like even Jane Addams, who's like my superhero in social work, Jane Addams said that the complexity of modern life is a huge problem. Like the year was 1890, you, you
Mhm.
know? So this was going on forever. And so what it made me think about, and Nevin and I, was how do adults actually perceive or look at and think about, in our work, teenagers, but all children. And there's this notion of them. and this is me putting on my experiential educator hat for a second, like this notion that children are this empty vessel that requires our expertise to fill them with knowledge, that they aren't making meaning and interacting actively with the world. So to get to pinball, like New York City banned pinball machines for 30 years in the 1940s. And this was because this story is actually hilarious. They threw like 200 to 300 pinball machines in the Hudson River, and then World War II happened, and we needed all this metal, so they had to go fish them out of. But we completely, this idea that this is gonna cause gambling addiction because a pinball machine looks like a slot machine. It has shiny, makes noises, and and so there's this notion that the kids can't handle all these things, when at the end of the day, they ended up being people that go to the moon and build bridges and do really amazing things. So there's this the kids these days effect is sort of when we really got this idea and we found some research to back it up that um, for instance, if we want to talk about social media and social media bans, there's studies today that show the more people think the kids are disrespectful and lazy, the more likely you are to say they can't have this thing that I didn't have as a kid. So they can't have violent video games. So there's this idea that they can't handle what the world is, when the truth is they do typically grow up eventually. So it was about really shifting our perspective on how we think about kids these days.
So, your book is about kind of understanding and supporting youth mental health. Would you agree with Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Anxious Generation, that there has been a rise in kind of mental health problems and anxiety in our youth?
I have liked a lot of Jonathan Haidt's work in the past, and the anxious generation I find deeply problematic. Not only does it feel like fear mongering, um, and some of the data is a bit cherry picked in it, but I something did shift. I mean, regardless of how we think about the diagnostic criteria, something did shift in the 2010s in relation to youth suicide, self harm, and to blame that. It's easy to pick on the phones for this because it's something that everybody has. So if we look at the data and say 1 in 4 adolescents and adults have a diagnosable, a diagnosed mental health mental disorder, what we also see is that 75% are kind of getting on with things. So to call it the anxious generation is sort of pathologizing a whole group of people. And so I thought that was a bit worrying. But youth anxiety in general has been deteriorating since the 1950s. So where I sort of disagree with, well, where I really disagree with hate is picking one thing that is something that everybody knows is annoying. It's weird when people are glued to their phones and not communicating with each other. Social media stinks. We're all fighting. And then there's videos that we have to see that we don't sign up for. All of these things are problematic. But we've seen youth anxiety deteriorating since the 50s, like I said, to the point where we use this as Gene Twingy's research as well, one of Jonathan Haidt's friends, that the average teenager in the 1980s had a level of anxiety that would have been hospitalized in the 50s. So we have
Mm.
seen this decrease. Do I think that's because of an inanimate object like a phone? I'm not convinced on that. I think the phone could play a part in it, and that's where I probably disagree with Haidt's thesis that all of a sudden new societal norms around social media will just solve this problem, where it was deteriorating well before phones fit in our pocket.
Well, it looks like you're about to be disproved because your country's just enacted a ban. And aren't you going to be eating some humble pie?
Well, well, the excuse me, the funny thing of that ban is the Anxious Generation came out in April 2024, and that ban was written into legislation by November of that same year. The federal government wrote it in 9 days. It was written in like what federal government can do anything in 9 days. It's pretty amazing. Um, and so that's been a big talk of the town. And to me, um, the social, talking about social media, um, it feels to me a bit like a moral panic. But at the same time, the bans and the phone free school movements, they feel like, to me, I'm gonna be really snarky about this, that it feels like a symbolic gesture. It's like, "Okay, we've taken care of this. All the kids are gonna be fine." And there's a lot of cognitive dissonance around it. I mean, Australia, the age of criminal responsibility is 10 years old. Like, a 10-year-old is supposed to know right from wrong, but can't handle, you know, TikTok. Like, it sort of there's parts of it that don't add up to me, and again, that's the way we think about kids. They are responsible enough on this thing that we care about, but not with this thing that we care about. So there's, but you're absolutely right. I mean, we're on the losing side of this battle, that this is gaining traction. Um, states in our country of the US, states are enacting phone-free schools and bell-to-bell bans. And even though this is at odds with just about every human rights organization saying you can't do this, and there's a lot of freedom of speech laws that are, and which this is the surprising part about Jonathan Haidt's argument here, that it's kind of at odds with what he's written previously.
Well, in your book, you talk about if we're going to take mental health seriously, we need to examine the environment more seriously. And, in your book, you talk about three levels in which the environment is kind of affecting kind of mental health. Talk about broadly characterized as interference, intervention, and ideology. And I wonder if you could just talk about, in your section on interference, you talk about two types. One is digital interference, and then quite differently, environmental toxins.
Yeah. So, as I said before we hit record, that we interviewed a group of experts, and one of them was Dr. Mari Swingle. She's a neurotherapist in Canada, lived an incredible life. I think she finished her bachelor's degree by 18 years old, and then moved to France, became a model, came back, did her master's degree in her clinical work. And she's very interested in the phones. She's someone, interestingly enough, that Jonathan Haidt does not cite in The Anxious Generation, which was interesting to us, that she was really at the forefront of mental health and technology. And the way that she wrote was that there's this digital interference, but there's also a possibility for digital integration. So she kind of has a hopeful story, but her argument was, and if we look at things like the infinite scroll on social media, what happens is it feels like you're active, your brain is active in something, but it goes on forever. It will never end. So you're always kind of hooked in what is coming next for me. So that was sort of an interference. We see how the phone can interfere with youth as anxiety. Look at sleep. Look at, we used to just get bullied on the playground, and now kids are bringing it home. Um, there's sexual exploitation with kids and the phones. So we see this digital interference, and then which is an interesting one, because it's also something we usually, I mean, we tried our best with our kids to delay getting them a phone as much as we could. Um, but we're the ones that end up buying it, which is also an interesting, angle to it. And we're also all glued to our phones too, for the most part. Um, and then the environment, this was, when we talked to Dr. Bruce Lamphere, who's a top 1% cited scientist. In academia, we rank ourselves based on how many other people cite our work. And so Bruce has worked with the EPA. He's worked with California Attorney General's office, and his focus was that when we led like as in leaded gasoline, lead in paint, um, that lead contributed to mental health issues much more than we think. And we spend most of our research funding on looking for genetic, um, uh, the relationship of our genes to mental health concerns, where I think most of us, and this is where holding a bunch of different ideas in our head can be really important, that when it comes to genes, if we look at rates like rates of autism, there's no chance genes change in 3 generations, from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 38. And so for me, I would say, well, we DSM-3, we opened up you know, you know, really made it easier to get this diagnosis. In Australia, we had a insurance, like a third-party payer scheme roll out in like 2012, 2013 that had a lot more funding opened up for people diagnosed with autism, and you just see a spike right there. So there's a financial interest. There's weird other angles to this. Now, to an environmental toxins researcher like Bruce Lanphier, he's saying no, 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 they're poisoning us. And the most compelling argument about this is looking at crime. And so there's an amazing graph. I wish we put this in the book, but there's an amazing graph if you look at the concentration levels of lead in the blood of children and then crime rates 20 years later. And it's a really it's a much higher correlation to, a behavioral concern than anything related to like social media. So what Bruce said, and this is a really kinda fascinating thing, and I'm still wrestling with it in my head, is Bruce said very much so kids are canaries in the coal mine when it comes to the environment that we have them in. And so like, the canary was brought into the mine, it was the most it was most sensitive to the gases, so when the canary got sick, everyone would get the hell out of the mine. Now, what happens today is if kids are telling us that they're more anxious, we can medicate, and then they can stay in the mine. And so, that was sort of the metaphor of looking at the toxins, that there's, uh, not to sound too tinfoil hat about this, but, like, there's a lot of stuff out there that a lot of chemicals that are related in the research world to mental health concerns. So it was interesting for Nevin and I that this was off the table, and to talk to an expert like Bruce was fascinating about, look at like early onset puberty. If you talk to a farmer about how to get your sheep to mature faster, it's chemicals and stress. And so look at the world we live in and look at how puberty rates are getting younger and younger. And seemingly, the data pans out, we're all more stressed. And, we're surrounded by um, some of these chemicals that aren't too good for us.
So a lot of emphasis placed on curing things rather than kind of preventing them. And that comes up all the time. Actually, just last week, there was a very compelling video um, editorial by a woman named Amanda Mustard about sexual abuse and pedophiles. And she did a interview of her grandfather, who's a pedophile, and
Mm,
she kind of makes the point that we've been conceptualizing it as these monsters out there, stranger danger and the like.
mm.
And no, the research really shows that it's family members, which makes it much more kind of complicated in terms of dealing with the whole issue. But more importantly, to our present discussion, um, lots and lots of money is spent on punishment and, essentially nothing on kind of the issue of kind of prevention.
Prevention gets barely a look in because it's hard to measure what you prevented because most people don't live a life of crime and most people don't do these things. I'll tell you a story about this. I helped a friend of mine, Mark Cartner, an indigenous man in Australia. Excuse me. He was a child abuse detective for a long time, And then he got burnt out, had some PTSD, and he said, "I gotta stop doing this work." He was working in very remote Queensland, and he convinced another police officer that they'll switch jobs. So he became a school-based police officer, and he's like, "I love the outdoors. I wanna work in the outdoors." And so he started this organization, and we built a really close relationship, and we're good friends. I helped him with measuring his data, measuring his outcomes. He was doing great work. He got another um, researcher to do qualitative data about the young people he was working with, and he created this program that, and this is a kind of inside baseball Australian context, but he made it so children at a certain school, they were referred by the teachers as, like, the most disengaged kids in the school, and really high risk, um, really challenged, disadvantaged young people. And what he did is he built this outdoor kind of therapeutic program, but dressed it up as the kids will all get a certificate 2 or 3 in outdoor leadership, outdoor recreation. Now, what that meant is the school ticked the box of the kids were getting an education. So he was taking them out of this traditional learning and they were getting a vocational certificate. The other thing about an outdoor recreation certificate is he taught them first aid. They learned responsible service of alcohol. Now you can get a job at any hospitality venue. They got a white card. That means you can work on a construction site. All of these amazing things. Now, Mark and I went with Mark to this. Mark won the Australian Institute of Criminology Silver Award for Best Crime Prevention Program, right? Now, this is he was the only he was working off of his salary as a police officer. There was no funding, no what he did was remarkable. And so we fly to Canberra to the capital. There's all these politicians, suits and ties, win this beautiful award. His boss gets a promotion for monitoring this crime prevention program. And then 6 months later, they said, "You can't do this anymore. We need boot camps. The crime is out of control. Gone." Unbelievable, right? No, so prevention is really funny. It's kind of like totally not sexy, right?
Mhm.
But the interesting thing, and I'd be interested to hear what you think about this in both of our roles as a therapist. I think what made Mark's program amazing could be, as far as prevention, these were kids that were really high risk, but it also just looked like good therapy. It was good relationship, doing something that feels like it matters, building a sense of mastery. Um, and these things, I think the interesting thing of prevention is if we were all gonna develop an amazing, therapy to help with youth, it would actually kinda look just like prevention. So,
Mhm.
it's interesting that we love these cures, CBT, DBT, ACT, motivation, interviewing, solution focused, EMDR, psychoanalysis, psychodynamic. This list goes on forever of how many therapies we've created. But it's still those common factors of relationship, hope and expectancy, the skill of the therapist to engage somebody. I think those are most important, and I think the data backs that up. But it's interesting that when it gets to prevention, we aren't giving it, at least equal weight to how would we prevent a youth mental health crisis. And now we're thinking, how do we intervene and have new legislation to cure a youth mental health crisis?
Um, yeah, I think, um, to make a slightly, different association, um, in terms of, Australia, I think, we could all do well to pay a little bit more attention to, the, children's program Bluey.
Mm,
Um, so, for example, you take an episode where it's the dad, Bandit, it's his birthday, and he wants breakfast in bed. And Bingo, his little child, is going to make it for him. And his mom, Chili, grudgingly agrees to kind of let her make an omelet. So, predictably, she is making a total mess of it. And she's doing it again and again, making a total mess. And upstairs, Bandit, the dad, saying, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry. And Bingo continues to make a royal mess of it. And eventually she gets it right. And and obviously it's kind of a moment of triumph for her. And that kind of having that faith in children to be able to figure it out and to kind of create an environment or the conditions where they can, through trial and error, figure things out is, I think, what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think,
That's all there in
going
Bluey.
yeah, yeah, it's very popular. I think about the figuring it out part, and, um, I don't think Nevin and I in the book went sort of hard enough on how the schooling system is created, um, and it's something where my head's at now, um, and this is just a fascinating historical perspective, but, like I brought up Jane Addams already, like, she was pivotal in women's right to vote, she was pivotal in, getting kids out of factories. She was the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. When she died in the 30s, she was the most famous woman in America, which was fascinating because many people we don't learn about her as often. So she was in Chicago. She created a summer camp for kids, and it was designed to end racism. That kids from all different backgrounds would come together and simply do things together. She believed in a free range childhood, which of course is like a buzzword these days. That's on page 9 of her book, 20 Years at Hull House. And one of the things, and this was like something I found amazing that I hadn't learned, is that Jane Addams was really close with John Dewey, who's the guru of experiential learning. John Dewey's mentor was William James, and so they were all um, together with this, American tradition of pragmatism. A lot of that comes from, Emerson, Thoreau, and these ideas from your neck of the woods as well. But there was this tradition that that to get better at anything, we do have to go do something, and that if we give kids things to do, they will learn from the doing. There's this experiential component, but you have to do the thing. And so they really believing in children that they have something to contribute, but only when you create an environment that's worth participating in. And a lot of the schooling system, and this is not a dig at educators because being a teacher is the most important job besides parenting. Rocket scientists and brain surgeons need teachers. So, but one of the things that happens is schooling becomes all about compliance. And so again, it's this view of children as passive. So the kid that's most annoying in your classroom, the one that pushes back, is also most likely to be the one referred to mental health treatment. Where again, this is like the canary in the coal mine, like the data that we found about the youngest child in a classroom getting diagnosed with ADHD. Like that's a statistical phenomenon, but are we medicalizing immaturity? And so when I look back at my own experience and I think about like I really didn't well, I loved high school because I didn't do anything, but I was always in trouble. Um, one of the things I look back to those 3 great thinkers, William James, John Dewey, Jane Addams, and their view of children was that they will step up when it matters, and that we can kind of loosen the grip on what we think is most important. And so I agree with you that it's about the learning to walk, the example we use in the introduction, that there's nothing your child failed at more, but you are okay with that failure because you knew it was gonna get somewhere. Now, in the teenage years when our brain does this huge, dumping of information and makes space for, this whole, incredible neurological development, we'd also know that if our kid, you know will have the smartest brain of any organism at 25 years old. We'd all take it. We'd all go, "Yeah, it's a great idea." But it's going to come with the pains of falling over emotionally and physically, of there's going to be challenges. Now, I think that that is also a slippery slope into saying, just get kids to do hard shit and put them outside and chop wood and go camping forever. I don't agree with that. I kind of more agree that, like, kids are doing hard things all the time when we see it and notice it, like learning to play an instrument or volunteering somewhere. Like I said, this generation volunteers more than any other generation on record. Um, so those sort of things I think are really interesting. Like you said, that it's okay for your kid to mess up making an omelet, and then they will probably figure it out or say, I'm not supposed to be a cook, and then that's okay. I mean, my daughter, she can't cook toast. She's a paramedic that drives and saves people's lives, you know? Like, it's amazing, it's so and going back to the idea of how we think about kids, I think it's hilarious. She's a terrifying driver. Like, I get in the car with her, I'm just like, "Are we even gonna make it?" But she can drive with lights and sirens on, you know? So that's my anxiety. That's my stuff going on in my head.
So, you you talk about kind of the issue that we really need to kind of pay attention to the environment, and you talk about kind of several different kind of layers of that. Um, and the importance of looking at these, as you put it, as wicked problems, not involving kind of simple kind of solutions.
Mm.
And unintended consequences and the extension of experience. And I guess this falls in the category of kind of problems of kind of intervention and how some of our interventions have created a climate where children are not exactly going to thrive.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
is a big question. I see, because it's easy when we think of extinction of experience to just harp on looking at a playground today versus a playground 50 years ago. They're totally different. We can look at kids don't range as far as they used to. I mean, there's a great graph that Nevin uses in a presentation, a chart where it shows a grandparent, how far they were able to roam from home, and then a parent, and then the child. So it's been going down. It's not like all of a sudden something happened. Um, and what I think, and not to get overly political about it, but as I read this stuff while simultaneously going through an election year last year, going through COVID and everybody fighting about what the right thing to do with COVID. Um, some of the issues related to the identity politics and people fighting on TV all the time and 24-hour news. It made me think, are we actually creating a world, not that you can create the world, but, like, are we creating an environment that's worth participating in? So when I see data that kids don't have sex anymore, they don't drink beer anymore, they don't go outside anymore, I'm sitting there going, "Yeah, but we've all scared the crap out of everyone about having a unique opinion about something, about pushing back and all the things that we would say, that's a superhero to be able to call BS on something." And so when I read that data, what it reminds me of is, I think, going back to schooling as this compliance system, that as long as you do exactly what you're supposed to, um, and read the books and memorize the things and do the tests, you will be fine and you can get through. But if you push back at the system, um, it's not gonna work out, and so, I mean, going back to Jane Addams and Dewey, I mean, Jane Addams' book, Social Ethics and Democracy, that democracy is really needs a serious revisiting these days because democracy is not just ticking a ballot box. It is also participating in something and being a part of the community. And our kids are the future of democracy. And so even John Dewey said the best classroom should mimic the best democracy. But the classrooms today have become quite authoritarian. We're only like 150 years into the compulsory schooling system. And I'm not that's about as far as I think about that. But so how are kids sort of, Dewey used the word inquiry a lot, and we're getting deeply, sort of surface level deep into philosophy here. But what he meant was how how do we like shake a snow globe and then see what happens? And so he wanted kids to be inquiring into the world, to be focused on learning things about the world, about themselves, about their community through doing things. And so if school is just sitting still and absorbing some expert's knowledge, it's not it can become a less than active learning environment. And so when we spoke with Ellen B. Hansen Sandseter, Norwegian like risky play expert, one of the things she talks about is like when your kid has a knife, let's say go back to cooking. They have
Mhm.
a knife and they're chopping an onion. And us as the parent, when our anxiety comes up and we go, oh my gosh, my child has a knife. The second we say, be careful with that, your child's mind is removed from the task that they're doing. And so now they're worried about what you're going to say as the spectator. And yes, they might get cut with a knife. But kids also really step up during risky times, and they're climbing a tree. Watch out for that branch. I heard a parent on New Year's Day this year. They were buying ice cream as a family. It looked like a really nice moment. And as the kids were walking out of this little farmer's market stand, there was like plants on the ground, like pot plants everywhere. And the parents said, "Watch out for that plant." And I just went, the kid was not at risk of running into a plant, right? And I'm pretty sure that kid was really focused on preserving their ice cream. Because they're sitting there going, "This is gold. This is treasure." So there are times when our own anxiety comes up that we can take kids out of the experience that they're in. That like when they're playing house or making a fort, that they're really invested in this and they're learning about their environment and they're doing an inquiry. If I set it up this way, what will happen? And so that's learning how to go back and forth with the world. And so I think there's something deeply eh, where I think we could all come together about democracy about this, that, we all I hear on the news is we're more divided than ever. And I'm going, and then what are we going to do about it? We probably need to go start talking to people that have differing opinions.
So, for somebody who wants to look at the world in complex terms, does not want to, look at the world in terms of kind of wicked problems and not
Mm.
to kind of have simple solutions. How do you maintain that perspective and yet don't get caught up in total inertia that the world is so kind of complicated that you can't do anything about it?
Mm.
How do you kind of take action when, for example, with climate change,
Mm.
we um, there's nothing we can do on an individual basis that's going to counteract the effect of some chemical company, releasing their sludge.
Mhm.
No amount of recycling is going to kind of do that. So, how do you kind of balance kind of an appreciation of complexity with the need not to kind of fall into despair or to find ways of taking constructive action?
Yeah. No, this is a great question, and this is sort of, it's one of the reason philosophers go mad is they worry they're trying to, uh, you know, pin down something that they can't pin down. And so they're trying to pin down this meaning of life, and it's so deep and big. And then the truth is, you do have to just get on living. And a story that I wrote about on the forward of my previous book, I I love the story of the great horse manure crisis of the 1890s. And what happened, how this is not a Netflix comedy special is beyond me. So New York City, had hundreds of horses. It was the main, form of transportation. And so what was I think so they'd go around and pick up all the horse poop. Like a horse poop's like, I think it's like 20 pounds a day of horse poop. And I promise you, there's a lesson to be learned about talking about poop. So so
Always
um,
interested in lessons about poop.
yes, good. So what happened is in the 1890s they held the first ever urban planning conference, and people from France, Italy, London, they all met in the Big Apple to go, what are we all gonna do with this poop? Like, when it's hot, it dries up, there's poop in the air, we can't they were in New York, they tried to pay farmers to take the poop to make manure, like, you couldn't get rid of this shit. And they blocked out 10 days for this is the part that should be a series. They blocked out 10 days for these people to come together and solve this shitty problem, right? They all fought so much with each other, they left after 3 days. They couldn't even last the 10 days. And then Henry Ford invented a car, and it was solved. And so there's this notion that sometimes sitting around and just talking about problems doesn't always lead to the solution that we want. So, yes, there's very real problems, but at the same time, there could be solutions that are elsewhere to this. Like I look at what's fascinating, and this is like this notion in the book of positive deviance. Like a really good example is like look at podcasts today. We apparently have the shortest attention span ever. And the most listened to episode of a podcast last year was Donald Trump on Joe Rogan for 3.5 hours. Like, who has 3.5 hours to go listen to anything these days, let alone, that guy? So there's this kind of, if we look for it, we can see exceptions to problems. And so I think kind of, and again, one of my other superheroes going to Thoreau, like really and I think this is really hard to do in a busy day-to-day life and if we're worrying about children, but challenging ourselves into what we think about. How are we going to think about this? What is really most important to me? Almost itemizing and putting things in order that, and I've used this example previously, like if my wife and I have had an argument about something, and it's usually because I did something stupid or, you know, didn't do something I said I was gonna do, forgot something, and we have a back and forth about it, and then we're sitting on the couch at night, maybe having a glass of wine, and I'm sitting there going, "Why are we fighting?" And then she might be sitting there going, "Why is he so annoying to live with?" Because 'Cause I'm a lot. And then but also, I'm sitting next to my best friend,
Mhm.
and I get to sit next to my best friend every day, and, like, what a privilege even if we've had an argument about something. So I think it's kind of holding things in perspective is really important, but it's also true, I think this is the hardest part of kids these days, is that many of us find solace in 7 habits, 12 rules, things that tell us what to do, but I think true freedom is knowing how to think, and I don't mean that to say other people don't. I think everyone knows how to think, but being able to choose what you think about. So if you're someone really animated and interested in the environment, I think any little thing you can do would probably give you a lot of um, it feels like the right thing. I'll say this a bit of a different way too. Like I've done a lot of research about the United States troubled teen industry. That's why Paris Hilton endorsed our book. And my PhD supervisor was a cult researcher. He's a fascinating dude. Um, and he always said, "You have to keep writing this stuff even if you don't see change, because no matter what, they'll never give you credit anyway." And I went, "At least I'm privileged enough to be able to do this thing that I think is the right thing." And Jane, going back to Jane Eyre, she quoted this in one of her books called well, she quoted Tolstoy, who said, "We can get stuck in the snare of preparation, which is waiting for other people to solve this thing, where the truth is just go for it and do the things that you think are really important." I think there's a lot to be learned from Thoreau and Emerson about these things, but I do I do think it's a lot to grasp. And when we do get into that analysis paralysis where I know there's a podcast about anxiety, like, that's not a good place to be. I'm a nervous flyer because oh, sorry, I'm supposed to externalize this now. I got called out for saying that. I can get nervous on planes, right? And my friend, she said, "Why do you say this?" I went, "Oh, yeah, you're right, I guess." So I'm one who can become a bit nervous on a plane. And it is just because I'm thinking what's going through the pilot's head. Where I bet if I could sit next to a pilot, I'd be fine, you know? And I'm out of control, and then I can think about the things that I can control, and that can be helpful. But, these big problems, it is demoralizing that the people who could do something about the environment don't. As well. So I think that's a good question, but I think it's the discipline of choosing what to do, what to think about, and those sort of things.
Well, and the small things make a difference. I mean,
Yes.
um, for example, you know, there's evolving type of therapy known as independence therapy, which is sort of
Mhm.
which I'm quite familiar with, in which you're just trying to find things that a child would like to do independently, and find a way of kind of encouraging them to do that. And it actually seems to be helpful for children's anxiety in areas that are not topographically related to what the independent action was. But when children can do things independently, there's really a sense of triumph.
Yeah.
Um,
It and that's where I think the like, overcomplicating working with kids. I mean, like, we cited this in the book about how important success and mastery was not only to the idea of, like, Outward Bound, but, like, the first psychiatry conference for children and adolescents in the US, the proceedings was all about success and mastery. It wasn't about what tranquilizer or stimulant. And so there is an important thing that sometimes the, the way we solve a problem in our lives sometimes doesn't have to have anything to do with what the problem is. So, like, for instance, when I was a naughty student in school, I was a nuisance to teachers because I didn't do anything. Um, and then I got asked to leave boarding school twice. Um, and then I enrolled in a work at your own pace school, and they handed me all the books and said, "When you're done with this, you're done with high school." And I went, "Okay." And I finished. So there is kind of this shift of environment. And then why did I become pretty good at university was I had the same opposition. I was like, "I don't think what you're teaching me is correct compared to other things I'm reading." And so it's kind of like there's this notion that we like, just to be, like, pretty basic strengths based, like, people will use what makes them awesome to, uh, to get through life. They don't this notion that there's this wild change. Yes, there might be a change in behavior, but they also, for young people and going into, like, independence, we can't change how they interact with independence. They're gonna be themselves in that environment. And so it's great when they learn about themselves and learn how to use that going into adulthood. So, um, it's why I was good at expedition work, was really not because I was trained very well as an outdoor guide. That came much later, but I'm good at being on all the time. I'm good at
Mhm.
being in a group of people. I think of myself as sometimes being a pretty good host. Like I can host a good dinner party and I can host a group of young people in the outdoors. That would be really challenging for other people. It's exhausting, you don't get a moment to yourself. So if you learn about yourself, you learn how to use of self, to use social work. You learn how to use yourself in the way that you know what you're participating in. And I think that is sort of something that's really important. It's hard to do when we all have jobs that can be a pain in the ass.
Right. All right. Well, we're about out of time. So, yeah, where um, where can people learn more about your work, and where where can they buy it these days? Understandings in supporting youth mental health. Um,
Yeah, sure. So anywhere you buy books, if you have a good independent bookstore, it'll probably be in there. If you buy your books from Amazon, it's definitely there, or Barnes and Noble, or I think you can buy from Walmart and Target, things like that. So anywhere you feel comfortable buying your book. It also has an audiobook, which is quite nice, narrated by Tim Morgan. Um, and he's a uh, voice actor and a school administrator, so it was kind of cool to have a someone who works at a high school narrate the book, which was nice. Um, uh, and then if you wanna contact me, Will Dobud. My name is pretty unique. I don't think there's another one of me out there, so you can find, me there on social media. I have a Substack called Unscripted that's in the theory of positive deviance, to ask unscripted questions, so it's usually just fun conversations like you and I have had today. And then, Nevin is also around, Nevin Harper. He's on LinkedIn, and he has a Substack called Adults in the Room, and he's been interviewing the experts that we talked to for the book again, and so putting that stuff out there publicly is really nice. But I'm a pretty open book, and I love connecting with people. I love this conversation and being able to wrestle with the ideas that I think about. So, yeah,
right.
I'm around anywhere, and so, yeah.
So, yeah, I would encourage everyone to kind of get the books. There's a very compelling discussion about kind of lead paint and just really getting us all to think about the issue of environmental toxins. The discussion with Marnie Swingle is quite interesting in terms of the effect of kind of digital interference, as she would put it, on our brains. And then also, um, you've uncovered some interesting people, Martin Broken Leg,
Mm,
talking about kind of uh, circles of kind of courage and a few other people. So thank you so much for coming in and talking with us today.
no.
Thank you for listening to Your Anxious Child. Please leave us a rating and review in iTunes to help us get the word out. If you'd like to learn more and find additional resources, visit us at edwardplimpton.com.